Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're putting on our historical detective hats to investigate arguably the most highly debated figure of the early church, Paul of Tarsus. We're going to tackle a massive question head-on. Did Paul faithfully pass down the teachings of Jesus, or did he somehow hijack the entire movement and invent a completely new religion? Well, we're going to let the historical sources and scriptural records speak for themselves.
Here is our roadmap for the investigation. We'll be looking at the inventor myth, Paul's apostolic credentials, the Jerusalem Council decision, his unity with Peter, and finally, the patristic witness. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. The inventor myth.
You've probably heard this one, right? It's a super common claim today that Paul essentially hijacked Jesus' message to create a completely new religion, totally disconnected from its Jewish origins. But we really have to ask, is that historically accurate? Was he an inventor, or was he carefully passing down a tradition he himself had received?
To get to the bottom of this, we have to look at the historical data that actually predates Paul's own written letters. Before a single New Testament book was even written, the core message of the early church was formalized into structured oral creeds. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7, Paul explicitly states he is delivering exactly what he received. This was a pre-existing tradition, not a brand new invention.
The historical chronology absolutely dismantles the inventor theory. The crucifixion happens around AD 30. Paul's dramatic conversion occurs right after, between AD 33 and 36, and within just 3 years of that, he's already in Jerusalem meeting with Peter. He received this oral tradition mere years after the cross, proving that the early Christian movement, then known as the Way, was already thriving in the book of Acts long before Paul ever wrote a single letter.
Moving right along to Section 2, Paul's apostolic credentials.
Now, you got to remember, the early church wasn't just handing out the title of apostle to anyone who asked. It was incredibly strict. Paul had to meet severe biblical criteria. He had to have seen the risen Christ and be commissioned directly by him, which he vigorously defends in 1 Corinthians 9 and 15, pointing right back to his dramatic Damascus Road experience. He also had to accurately deliver those inherited oral traditions we just talked about, and crucially, his ministry had to be validated by the original eyewitnesses.
And that brings us to the book of Galatians. Paul didn't just operate in a vacuum, completely unchecked. He actually went up to Jerusalem for a 15-day, face-to-face investigative inquiry with Peter, often called Cephas, and James. He willingly submitted himself to a rigorous examination by the original primary apostles. And the result of that investigation? They formally accepted him and Barnabas, explicitly extending the right hand of fellowship.
Okay, Section 3, the Jerusalem Council decision.
So, what about the accusation that Paul completely abandoned Jewish law? Well, in Philippians 3, Paul proudly calls himself a Hebrew of Hebrews and a strict Pharisee. He maintained his orthodox, monotheistic devotion perfectly intact. Actually, if you look at Acts 21, you'll see him actively participating in Jewish cultural and religious traditions. He even pays for the sacrifices and undergoes purification rites for Jewish believers who are taking a Nazirite vow. That's a huge deal. It proves without a doubt that he never taught Jewish believers to forsake Moses.
So how exactly did they handle the theology of the law under Christ, especially the intersection of Jewish and Gentile believers? Well, the Acts 15 Jerusalem Council made a very deliberate, formal distinction. Jewish believers were to maintain their kosher and Torah traditions. But for Gentile converts, the council applied a standard that closely aligns with the universal Noahide laws, basically abstaining from meats offered to idols, from blood, and from fornication. And Paul championed this exact unified two-pronged ruling.
And if you need more proof that he didn't abandon his roots, just look at his letter to the Romans. He flat out asks, has God rejected his people? By no means. He points right to his own Israelite heritage as proof, teaching that the law of Moses and the grace of the new covenant were actually complementary parts of God's plan, not a total contradiction.
All right, let's turn to Section 4, Unity with Peter. Now, skeptics love to point to the famous incident at Antioch in Galatians 2 as their absolute proof of a fractured, totally divided church. What happened was, Peter, who was initially eating with Gentile believers, suddenly withdrew. He did this out of fear of a strict Jewish faction, basically yielding to cultural peer pressure regarding table fellowship. Paul saw this hypocrisy and corrected Peter right there in public.
People view this as a massive division. But here's the thing, it actually proves the exact opposite.
It shows Paul exercising equal apostolic authority. Think about it. If Paul were just some rogue secondary figure inventing his own theology, he would have had literally zero standing to rebuke the primary apostle of the Jerusalem church. This conflict proves Paul possessed the legitimate, recognized authority to correct a peer.
So did this argument split them into warring factions? No way. Paul was sent specifically to the Gentiles, while Peter's ministry later converges with Paul's. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 and 16, Peter writes to the church, completely validates their shared, precious faith, and explicitly refers to Paul's letters as Scripture. They were absolutely working together, and Peter himself firmly established their enduring apostolic unity.
Finally, Section 5, the patristic witness. Think about this logically. If Paul was truly a rogue inventor, his teachings would have been forcefully, immediately rejected by the successors of the original 12 apostles. Instead, what do we see? We see unbroken continuity stretching right into the 2nd century. Apostolic fathers like Clement of Rome, Polycarp, and Ignatius entirely embraced Paul. And the leaders who were personally discipled by Paul, men like Timothy, Titus, and Luke, they carried his orthodox, unified teachings forward to the next generation without missing a beat.
Take Polycarp, for example. Early church historians point out that his epistle to the Philippians is basically a veritable patchwork of quotes from the New Testament. He effortlessly weaves Paul's letters right into his own pastoral exhortations. He doesn't treat them as a secondary source. He treats Paul's writings as foundational, authoritative truth for the whole church.
And then you have Ignatius of Antioch confirming the same structural unity. He emphasizes a unified church leadership that directly inherited its authority from the Apostolic Council, a council that both historically and functionally fully included Paul. These early church fathers saw absolutely zero division between the Christianity of Peter and the Christianity of Paul. It was one unified faith.
This historical evidence leaves us with a pretty profound reality. From the crucifixion to the pre-existing early creeds to Paul's validated ministry with the original apostles, all the way into the writings of the 2nd century, there is an unbreakable chain of continuity. Paul wasn't an inventor. He was a faithful messenger who met every strict biblical requirement for apostleship. But if that's true, it means the letters we read today aren't just one guy's personal theological spin. They are the unified, fully authorized voice of the earliest Christian movement. So the ultimate question is, knowing this undeniable historical continuity, how does that change the way you read those letters today?